Last week, I talked to more than, a dozen leaders who were suddenly lost their jobs, their programs were eliminated, or resources changed like in a day. And one man said to me, he's like, I just sat in my car after the carpool drop off and I stared at the dashboard. I knew big decisions had to happen, but it just felt paralyzed to move. And another woman texted me. She's like, my boss got laid off yesterday, and I'm faking that I know how to do his job. And I'm just working so hard to keep my team calm. I mean, these are great people. They're good leaders, and their experience of this feels like all of us right now. And it shows us, I think, that while we feel like we're in some kind of cultural crisis, we're actually experiencing a leadership crisis. And I have great hope that we can get ourselves out of it. So welcome to the Joyosity Podcast. If you are new to us, we base everything on three bedrock beliefs. One is that the connection of our true humanity is what matters. Two, if we approach things with genuine curiosity, we can create positive culture with complex people, because complex people is all we have. And three, joy is at the center of everything that we do, because that is what makes the difference. It is the heartbeat of a healthy leader and a healthy organization. And so grab your multiple beverages, because I always have multiples, and get your headphones ready. We're going to give you mic drop moments. You might even want to grab some Post-its to take notes, because today's guest, I literally can't even wait to I'm like so excited. Our expert today is Jo Saxton, and I'm going to try to contain my fangirl energy, because Jo has had a significant impact on my own leadership journey through her books and her teaching. Her podcast with Steph O'Brien, called the Lead Stories Podcast, really got me through a leadership crisis and a toxic work environment way back in 2016. She's a Nigerian Londoner who has lived in the States for decades. She's a powerhouse in leadership, culture, and purpose-driven impact. She's an author and a speaker and a leadership coach, the founder of the Ezra Collective. I mean, I could keep going, but she equips women to step in their leadership with clarity and confidence. And she's led organizations, advised executive teams long before this uncertainty became how we just tended to operate. So here's what I love about Jo. She doesn't just talk about leadership as a concept. She talks about leadership as a deep responsibility and service, but not at the cost of the leader. And so she is so welcome here in this space. And so I can't wait for you to meet Jo.
Hello.
Oh,
You're so very kind.
Oh, it's all true. I am not an idle flatterer. So those of you who've listened to the podcast before, I always like to start. How did you get here? To give us a little bit of your story to help us place you? How did you come from London, to be this leadership expert and experienced in the United States?
Well, like many of us, probably accidentally in part, excuse me. I grew up in London, as you said, and moved to the States about 20 years ago. I think my jobs in my English part of my life, I was working at churches and working in nonprofits, worked at a university. And I think I've always been curious about leadership. I think that would be true. I think that's been the through line of wherever I've been working or whatever I've been involved with. I've always, because I felt the impact, like all of us, I felt the impact of good leadership, whether it's in your community, whether it's in the business you're working for, whether it's in the churches I was in. I felt the impact of good leadership and bad leadership. And so that's probably why it's been the through line for me. And I think as well, having this sense of a calling and vocation and draw towards leadership, and often feeling underinvested in. And sometimes it not just feeling it, but being it and thinking, how do you get to where you want to go? And what would it take? I think a seminal moment for me that has defined things decades on was probably when I went to college. And I went to college in England. And I was in a friend's, like in a dorm, in a friend's room, and they were talking about their musical instruments they grew up playing. And and how they dropped them and how they were all gathering dust in different corners. Do you know what I mean? It was that kind of thing. And I noticed myself have a disproportionate emotional response to it. I'd done music at school for a little while, so it wasn't about that. And I tried to work out what it was. And I remember walking home from my friend's place, and thankfully I hadn't kind of emotionally vomited on them. I was just like, what? Why am I feeling fundamentally uncomfortable? And it threw me back. I had this flashback to the own neighborhood I grew up in, which was a very marginalized neighborhood full of multiple immigrant communities. It's completely gentrified now, but at the time, it was like lots of different groups of people. And it was a kind of neighborhood that people said underperformed and all that kind of thing. And I remember thinking aloud, and I think even praying aloud, thinking, this is not an achievement gap. This is an access gap. This is an access gap. We didn't have access to the resources, the investment, the opportunities, so that 10 years later we could say, oh, I used to, and this was no criticism of my friends. This is no criticism of my friends, but I just recognized that we didn't have access to whether we could play the flute or not. That was not an option. That was not an instrument available at our school. We did not have access to whether we could join sports teams. That was not an option in our school. And it just got me thinking, what would be the difference of the lives I knew and my friends if we'd had access to opportunities, access to pick things up or turn things down, if that was our normal? And it wasn't our normal, so we didn't see those results. And we didn't have the roundedness that we often see in a person, in a leader, because of the things they've got to experiment with and try and explore. And so I think that has been a through line for me of always wanting to make sure that people had access. And I think that's brought, when I got to the States, I mean, I had my kids pretty early on, so I was just in the kind of fog of young children. But then again, working with nonprofits, working with churches, and it just being the increasing, it just got louder and louder and louder for me, particularly, and I'm sure you've been in similar situations, when you walk in the room and you're the only one.
Yeah.
And thinking, I know it's not a lack of talent. It's not a talent lack, it's an access lack.
Yes.
And thinking, until you build pipelines that connect you to the people you say you desire to have in your teams, and recognize that those pipelines could look different according culturally, gender wise, or whatever, life stage wise, don't be surprised if you have the same results.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think it's been a combination of all of those things: identifying access gaps, thinking, what can I do to help close access gaps, that have fueled the kinds of things I do.
Oh, it's so good. And as I have watched you over many years, I've seen you as well as a leader say, I'm not going to take that speaking event, that thing, whatever it is, because someone else needs that access. I can keep going. And I've watched you do that as well and say that publicly. And I just think that's an important thing to bring into this, that you saw the lack of access and not only studied leadership and wanted to invest in people, but also giving them the opportunities to try and experience.
Absolutely.
So it's so good. And I've been hesitant to talk about leadership and cultural crisis because I am not one that's prone to hyperbole unless it's going to be funny. And but I think we really have this feeling of overwhelm right now. Like we feel it culturally, but I just come back to this idea that it's a cultural crisis that is what we see. It's the presenting injury, but it's a leadership crisis because leaders are overwhelmed. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, well, one, where do you think this overwhelm comes from, and who does it benefit when leaders are overwhelmed, and how does that then shape the way we lead in workplaces and cultural places?
I mean, I think there's probably been a lot of leadership overwhelm building for some time. Really. And I think the 2020s have been quite a distinct period, the last 4 or 5 years, whether it was like globally with the pandemic. I mean, to have the entire world on shutdown in once, speaking broadly, and to be significantly affected by that for a year or so is huge. And having to, I think it being an accelerator and a microscope on people's lives and showing what we were like and how we were functioning, I think was one piece. And I don't know that people get to recover Like, did everybody get a sabbatical at the end of that time and say, okay, now you'll get refreshed and vision? Or was there another thing? I think the geopolitical landscape has added a sense of crisis. And the nature of how things are discussed, and the nature of how things, even the tone, I think, has presented crisis.
Yeah.
I would say, and again, on one level, I've lived here 20 years, but on another level, I've only lived here 20 years. And so, but when I think of when I moved here, and I remember watching the first couple of elections and thinking it really was a matter of who you disagreed with. And it wasn't that there weren't people who felt very, very strongly about it. They did, but there was a civility. There was an ability to have a civil conversation. There was a lot less assumptions. And I would say the volatility of our landscape, and in some ways the people involved, and the people involved in the way they talk. And not only that, not just the people involved in the political positions, but the tech industry and their influence in that as well, all add a level of intensity. And I think, this is a sobering thing to say, but I think when we are overwhelmed, I think the question you ask is the question: who benefits? Who benefits from the overwhelm? Because if the overwhelm means that we're not as alert, we're not as attuned, I think overwhelm can cause you to just shut down and check out and think, well, I'm not going to pay attention. I don't do that kind of stuff. But at what cost?
Right.
At what's happening? Because there are contexts where overwhelm is the plan. Sometimes overwhelm is just life. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes distraction is just life. Sure. Sometimes it is we took on too much. We said too many yeses. We forgot the word no. I get that. But sometimes the overwhelm and the distraction is a strategy.
Yeah.
And I think our discernment as leaders is to know the difference, because it can happen at a macro level, but it can also happen at a micro level. It can happen in our context. You described a toxic workplace. And we will see, it can happen in a family. I think for me, this moment is reminding me of as a leader, I need to be able to identify with a non-anxious presence where overwhelm is. I need to be able to not just critique overwhelmed, but to diagnose it.
Yes.
And to diagnose its source, diagnose what its intent, and not be super suspicious of every time I'm overwhelmed and say, who did this? Do you know? Because that's not wise. But be able to take a step back and say, what is fully going on here?
Yes.
I think that's been the thing that I've been most mindful of with the overwhelm.
I think that there's so many good things about what you just said about truly diagnosing the overwhelm. We all are aware. I think most of us are aware that the goal of any social media site, any site, is to keep us on there.
Yes.
From LinkedIn to Instagram, Twitter, whatever it is. Like the goal is to keep us on there. And so the diagnosis is, am I just falling prey to every alert? I have so many alerts are turned off on my phone. And am I falling prey to that? Who wants to keep my attention and why? And then it happens too on this level in your office, where we just continually think that there is no limit to human capacity. Well, if we just maximize, if we just do this, we can push people further. And you as the leader, sometimes we said too many yeses and forgot the word no, but sometimes we've been put upon and we haven't said, wait, this is beyond what I can do. I have a client right now who I'm speaking to their organization, and it's a large healthcare organization. And she has asked me repeated questions. Often I say repetition is a mercy. So I you forget, like that happens. But as I have noticed the way I've interacted with this group for the last 6 months, how they over carbon copy all of these people. I'm like, you are overwhelmed because your communication pattern means you can't take in all the information in a logical way. So it's sobering. All of these distractions in all kinds of places, but diagnosing it, I think, is just such an important piece. Like, is this me? Have I done this? Has this been put upon me? What can I do to change that? And that brings up this next question for me is like, when we're talking about, so we both have kids that are similar ages, these upper teens, early 20s, college, like, and when I had 4 kids that were 6 and under, fog is a good way to describe that experience. And I was working, and I think, gosh, some of the things that I used to do then don't always work anymore.
No.
And one of the things you said recently in a newsletter was about the difference between playing checkers when the game is chess.
Yeah.
So what's a leadership move that used to work maybe for you, or you watched work in the late 90s and early 2000s, but right now it's not working. It really keeps people stuck. Like, what's the chess move that we need to do?
I think one of the moves was not even understanding the landscape, because if you don't there were some basic assumptions I think the chess move has been, what are my assumptions? What are my assumptions about human behavior? What are my assumptions about work? What are my assumptions about what people want, what people desire, what institutions desire? That I could this institution wanted change, but it wasn't under as much financial pressure then. So it had time. It had time to explore things. It had time to innovate. Now it may say it wants change, and it's like, this is a panic button.
Yeah.
Those are 2 different moves.
Yeah.
And those are 2, it's like you hear the same language, but it's not the same word. The word changed meaning somewhere along, because it's driven by different things.
Yeah.
It's driven less by exploration and more by the metrics of what the money it's going to make for somebody else. And I'm not even making a judgment of whether that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's the landscape. And I think I realized in this moment of overwhelm, the checkers game was, like you say, the clickbait. I thought, I was expecting to be baited by, I don't know, like I read something on protein once, and then a billion ads on diets come my way, and I'm like, I wasn't asking, but thank you very much. And I expected that. I expected to, and I'd be annoyed by that. But was I expecting to be clickbaited by news or opinion news or opinion news that does not make the distinction between itself and actual information, actual researched information, rather than the heightened opinions of the single story, which has a dictated perspective. And I think it's like, I think some of those things were, my checkers game was, that's such an annoying thing, blah blah blah. And now my chess game is, I choose when I read news, thanks.
Yes.
I choose who, I choose the breadth that I feel is healthy. I actually don't need to know what you're saying, because I'm not on your timetable, and the urgency that you're presenting has far more to do with your urgent need for me to react than my urgent need to hear it right now.
Yes. Yes.
And I've had to, and it's like, for me, like, there are no notifications, because I'm like, I'm a firm believer that as leaders, we need to be aware of what's happening in the world, but can we do it on our time frame so we can receive it well?
Absolutely.
Rather than bang, 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 bang all the time with all of these things, and then wonder why we're feeling slightly hammered by all the things that are coming our way and demanding attention, because the titles and the headlines are designed to demand our attention.
Absolutely.
And that's one thing when it's a newspaper that you go to somewhere to pick up and buy. It's another thing when it invites itself into your phone.
Yes.
Or your watch.
Or it ding, 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 like it dings at you, which distracts. And I mean, we're not even talking about the brain distraction of that, but the heart distraction of that.
Absolutely.
And I think so important. I used to think when, email first started, like I was teaching, so I didn't check my email, all the time. I checked my email at specific times. When I became a school leader, I wasn't in the classroom as much. So I was much more in front of my computer, even more than I was when I was teaching. And then when I moved into corporate spaces and consulting, it was much more in front of my computer all the time. And I think that is one of the biggest chess moves that I changed, that I was like, I have to respond to this immediately. That's not actually true, because when I used to sit down and my teacher, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to get back because I haven't been there so long. And I realized actually that was the better move. like, here's when I can process this information rather than trying to do it on the fly all the
Yeah,
time.
that's good.
And I've definitely had clients where they're like, well, the client emailed me and they need an immediate response. I'm like, do they? Like, are any of us actually doing work that if we don't respond within 10 minutes, someone will be harmed?
Yeah.
Most of my clients are not that. They're not the
Yeah.
surgeon.
Yeah. This isn't the emergency services.
This
Get
is
it.
not what we're doing. And I think that it's the same when we're talking about, we feel all of this from everywhere, these clickbait headlines, the desire for us to be attached to alerts and notifications all the way through our regular Slack channels and emails that we work
Yeah.
with. So when we decide, okay, here's how I'm going to process and respond, I think it gives us not only that piece of like, okay, I have agency here, but it also
Yeah.
shows our teams like, oh,
Absolutely.
you don't have to just keep this breakneck pace all the time.
Yeah, it models something completely different.
Yeah. One of the things that I also think is so interesting what you just said is things change. Like, we're not saying stuff doesn't change. The pace of change is what feels different, I think, right now.
Yeah.
Because the speed of information, like, everything changes so quickly. If you got a new phone, it's outdated in 18 months. Whereas I had the same phone in my parents' house for a decade. And I think that puts us into a more state of reactivity. Like,
Yes.
it's so much more tempting to react because we feel like, oh, this pace of change.
Mhm.
So what happens when people don't stop and think, when they give into that reactivity as a leader? What is the impact for themselves and for the people that they lead?
I mean, I'm even sobered by that question in terms of what happens when we don't stop and think. What are the conversations that shouldn't be happening? What are the decisions about budgets and layoffs or whatever that aren't happening because we are reacting to the moment? It's like, are we on panic mode or instant mode? And I know that there is a sense of sometimes leading from our gut and sometimes that is the best response. Sometimes it is, but is it always? Is that the tone and are at that level of urgency and with the cortisol surging as constant? Is that the best way? Because part of our leadership abilities and our gift and skill set and our talent comes from what we're thinking. And it requires us to be critical thinkers and robust thinkers and informed thinkers. So when you take that out, when you take out the time to get informed, fully informed, the time to calm down and distance yourself from whatever you're deciding, to calm down and to be able to think, like, again, the difference between chess and checkers, and forgive me if you're a checkers champion, but they're immediate moves. They're pretty much, I mean, they're going, they're immediate moves. That was the metaphor there. Whereas chess is long game and moves that might seem lateral, but actually are getting you where you want to go. If we're not having time to, now sometimes because we're skilled as leaders, those become our quick moves. But again, is it wise for us to think that we can chronically lead without having time to think and then not be consequences? Somewhere it's going to come outside. If it's not directly with the work, is it with your health? Is it with your mental health? Is it with your relationships? Is it with your priorities? Because otherwise, are we led? We think we're leading, but we're being led by the tyranny of the urgent. That doesn't sound like that's going to end well. It doesn't feel like it's going to go very far, and it doesn't feel like it's going to end well. No. And how many of us have led in such a way and are dealing with regrets from decisions that were just made, just if we'd had a bit more information, if we didn't feel so much pressure. And I know that life affords us some deep pressures right now, and in some ways all the more reason to work out how we think and what our pockets of time and decompression and learning are. What's our, like, what does it look like to I keep thinking about being retooled. How do I retool myself for this world, this leadership landscape, this environment? Just like when you went from teaching to consulting, there are different tools. I
had to learn a whole new vocabulary.
You get up differently, you spend your day differently, you spend your
Mhm,
time differently, you interact differently with people. I
mhm.
think part of our challenge as leaders in this current climate is that for many of us, we are doing the same job, but the world changed.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that and like we kind of expect it when we've moved from one field to another.
Mhm.
And it's a different challenge. But when you're like, hold on, I was in tech then, I'm in tech now, but it ain't the same tech. I was
Yeah.
in education then, I'm in education now. It's not the same thing. I was in healthcare then, I'm in healthcare now. Why is it so different? All
Mhm,
I've done is just show up to work every week.
mhm.
But actually, the cultural shifts, the seismic shifts, that it's like the tectonic plates of our culture are shifting and keep on shocking us, and all of that. That does change things.
It does, and I think it's so important to name that because
Mm.
whenever things change, we experience, not necessarily we revert to our old coping mechanisms, but we are
Mm.
definitely tempted to.
Yes.
We're very tempted to. And
Yeah.
so when we name it, we're like, "Oh, this is what I'm feeling." I can never remember who said it, but Emily P. Freeman is the one I always hear say it. But she quotes the real person, and I forget. I think it's Richard something. Anyway, he says that we get into trouble when we don't name things properly.
I mean, that is so true.
It's like, "Oh, this is why
I
this is
mean,
what is happening." The reality.
that is huge. I mean, okay, two words as an example: anger, grief.
Yeah, totally. Not that they
J-
don't commingle,
No.
but which one, like, where's my driver here? And
Mm.
am I responding or reacting
Yeah.
because I think that I am angry and disrespected when
Mm.
actually I feel disregarded and
Yeah.
like I don't belong?
Oof.
Those are two different things.
Yeah.
And we have to name it properly. Oh my gosh. I'm so glad we have a second episode because I have so many more questions to ask you. And so please, y'all, make sure that you tune in next week. We're gonna come back and really talk about, well, what do we do then?
Yeah.
How do we as
Mm.
leaders make this different? So hold your horses because we will be back next week. So let me put my coach hat on for just a moment. Don't just leave this here. Take a moment. What did you learn? What's your next tiny action step? Share this episode with someone and tell them what you're going to do. Check the show notes for all the links and connect with us on LinkedIn and all the other socials, or just, drop me an email at Jen with 2 N's at jenwhitmer.com. We want to keep this conversation going with you. I know your earballs have a lot coming at them, so thank you for listening to the Joyosity Podcast and being a part of our community. Please take a moment to rate and subscribe. It helps more people join us in the movement to create positive culture with complex people. So work is a joy, people are whole, and organizations flourish. Can't wait for you to join us next week.